It's exactly 1:10, and we're ready to reconvene. We are now going to talk about exposure scenarios of turf fields, and that's going to be Jocelyn and Asa, and I will let Patty introduce them.
Okay, as we discussed in the early section, we have collaborated with the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and also with scientists in UC Berkeley. And Dr. Asa Bradman is our collaborator doing the time activity study, and he will give the presentation. But also before the presentation, I want to introduce, we have Dr. Paloma Beamer, and she's on the phone with us, and she is the author on the last part of the study. And so she's going to tune in. She's also involved in the time activity study. Okay, let's start the presentation. We'll start by discussing the exposure scenario development by introducing the exposure pathways and receptors category for synthetic turf field. Speaker is Dr. Jocelyn Clark from OEHHA, and then it will follow by Dr. Asa Bradman to describe and give preliminary data on the online survey data related to soccer player. So Jocelyn Clark.
Okay, thank you. So as Dr. Wong said, we'll talk about the exposure scenarios. So this slide just shows a timeline of the exposure scenario task. So we're collaborating with UC Berkeley and University of Arizona to do a time activity behavior study. So the details of the study follow the recommendations we received from the panel at the last SAP meeting. And using IRB-approved study designs and protocols, activity data was collected from synthetic turf fields from users either through a survey or through videotaping. Dr. Asa Bradman will provide more specific details on the study and present some of the data collected later on. Information from the results of the study will be used in OEHHA's exposure assessment of synthetic turf fields. So before we actually talk about the study, I would like to introduce the receptor groups that we were evaluating and also the pathways of exposure. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So following input obtained in our last meeting, we decided to focus our study on soccer only due to its popularity and the tendency for players to start playing at a young age and continuing on through adulthood. It is also very popular for both males and females. So the three main groups we were interested in are athletes, the coaches, the referees, and also the bystanders. So athletes are the players who participate in the practices and the games. They may play for just a season or they may play all year round, which is common in California. They can range in age from young children all the way up to adults. And they may also play one or multiple positions. We're interested in looking at all the positions since they do include different activities which can lead to different types and levels of exposures. For example, goalies may stay close to the goal area, as we did talk a little bit about earlier, and they may dive for the ball frequently, whereas a forward may constantly be running up and down the field and may not dive as much. A statewide survey of this receptor group was recently conducted by Dr. Bradman and his colleagues. As Dr. Wong mentioned, it recently closed about 2 weeks ago, and some of the preliminary data results from this study will be discussed in the next section. So the coaches are the team leaders and trainers, and the referees are the officials who enforce the rules and provide arbitration on the fields. They may be current or former players themselves and are assumed to be adults. The bystanders can be the family or friends of the athletes who are present at the field to observe the activities, whether it be a practice or a game, and they may range in age from young babies to adults as well. For each of these groups, we will evaluate the three main exposure pathways. We will look at inhalation, dermal, and ingestion. So for the inhalation pathway, exposure occurs when chemical vapors from the field or fine particulate matter is released into the air, and synthetic turf users or bystanders at the field breathe it in. This is a pathway that cannot be avoided if you're at or on the field. So we expect that each receptor group will be exposed through this pathway to some varying degree level. Athletes are expected to have the highest exposures since they may run, slide, fall on the field, which can kick up particles for inhalation. Goalkeepers in particular can have high exposures from constantly diving onto the field and inhaling close to the surface. Coaches and the referees may also have high inhalation exposures. They do engage in moderate to high intensity activities. They may run up and down the field, the referees, for example, to follow the field activity. Bystanders are expected to have lower exposures since they participate in lower level activities such as sitting or standing on the sidelines and cheering. So moving on to the dermal pathway. So dermal exposure occurs when chemicals are transferred from the field onto the skin and then enter the body through the skin. So this can occur directly through skin contact with the field surface where the crumb rubber particles adhere to the skin. Athletes, they may often wear short pants and short sleeves in California with moderate climates. And so when they have contact with the turf and practices during games, they may have contact. During warm-up exercises, such as sit-ups and push-ups, they may be directly on the field. They may also push off the field with their hands if they fall. And they also lunge, slide, and fall repeatedly. Bystanders may sit directly on the field. You can see kind of in the picture here to watch the games or practices. Toddlers and young children may crawl or play around on the sidelines. They may also roll with their arms and legs contacting the field. And they also play with the crumb rubber so they can have dermal contact via their hands. And while coaches and referees routinely spend time on the field, they are not expected to fall or dive as the athletes do, or sit on the turf like the bystanders. We anticipate that their exposures through this direct dermal pathway may be negligible. So dermal exposure can also occur indirectly through chemical release from the field into the air or onto an object, and then followed by skin uptake. So all receptors are expected to be indirectly exposed through the air, but this pathway is unlikely to be predominant, especially in an outdoor environment like a synthetic turf field. We'll use chemical concentration data from the field characterization to evaluate the significance of this pathway. So chemicals and particles can also be transferred to the skin by an object. For example, the soccer balls, soccer gloves, and shoes are in constant contact with the field. Athletes have been observed touching their cleats on the field, sort of knocking off the crumb, and goalies may hold their gloves in their hand, which frequently contact the ball. Coaches and referees may also have frequent contact with the ball and also similarly with their shoes. Bystanders may play with the soccer ball or other kinds of soccer equipment, such as like the little soccer cones after practices or games. And they may also have water bottles, which they rest on the field while watching, and then they may pick those up and have exposure that way. So ingestion exposure occurs when crumb rubber particles get into the mouth and are swallowed. This can be a direct pathway, which is incidental or intentional. Incidental ingestion occurs when particles accidentally get into the mouth and are swallowed. Athletes are expected to be exposed through this pathway through falling or diving onto the field. Particles may be dispersed into air and get into the mouth and be swallowed. For goalies who dive frequently, this may be an especially important pathway. We assume that coaches, referees, and the adult bystanders will not dive or fall into the field and may have negligible exposure through this pathway. Intentional ingestion is when the receptor knowingly or purposefully puts crumb rubber into their mouth and swallows it. Toddlers and young children who play on the sidelines and play with the crumb rubber may ingest small amounts during games or practices. For athletes, coaches, referees, and the adult bystanders, intentional ingestion is expected to be a negligible pathway. So ingestion can also occur indirectly, in which chemicals or particles get transferred from the field into the mouth through some kind of carrier. So for hand-to-mouth pathway, this occurs when fingers or hands come in contact with the field, or an object can come into contact with the field, and then the hands or fingers can touch the mouth or face, or hands that touch the object can touch the mouth or face. All receptors are expected to have exposure through this pathway to varying degree levels. After contact with the field surface, athletes or bystanders, they can bite their nails or just touch their face or use their hands to wipe away sweat while they're on the field. Coaches and referees can touch the soccer ball and then touch their mouth or face. And toddlers and young children who crawl around the sidelines may touch the rubber, the field surface, and then suck their fingers. Next pathway is hand to object to mouth. So this occurs when the hands come into contact with the field and then touch an object, and then the object is put into the mouth. This is a very indirect pathway that all receptors may have some exposure through. For athletes and bystanders, they may touch the field surface and then handle or eat food with unwashed hands, or touch the drinking spout of a water bottle and then drink through it. Bystanders on the sidelines, they may put the arms of their sunglasses into their mouths while watching. And toddlers and young children who touch the field may use their unwashed hands to pick up food or an object such as a pacifier and a toy, which then goes into the mouth to cause exposure. Coaches and referees can exhibit hand to object to mouth activity through whistle blowing activities. Their hands may touch the surface and they touch the whistle, which they then blow through. Object to mouth exposure occurs when objects that come into contact with the field are put into the mouth or touched to the face. We expect all three receptor groups to be exposed through this pathway. Athletes may use clothes which have contacted the field to wipe sweat off their face. Goalies have been observed using their teeth to take off their gloves, which frequently contact the ball. They may also drink water from bottles which have contacted the field surface. Coaches and referees may drop their whistles onto the field and blow through them while they're still unclean. And young children may touch their face or mouth with objects such as toys that have been on the field, or put them into their mouth. So kind of to summarize, we've discussed the individual receptors and we've discussed the pathways. So this slide kind of shows an on-field pathways model to bring them all together. So you can see on the left side, the synthetic turf field would be the source of exposures. And then the next column shows possible environmental releases from the field. Then through some exposure media or transfer activity, exposures may occur in one of three pathways: inhalation, dermal, or ingestion. And we anticipate that different exposure pathways may or may not occur for some receptor groups, and that some pathways may not be as predominant as others. So then now in this next section, Dr. Asa Bradman will give a presentation to discuss the time activity behavior study that is being conducted and share some of the results of the California survey of soccer players.
Pause for questions, or we just keep going at this point? Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Claude, and thank you for the opportunity to present to the panel. So I'm going to be talking today in the first part about our project characterizing exposure-related behaviors for the TURF project. I want to thank co-authors and also contributors to this project, Carly Highland and Rosemary Castorina from Berkeley, and both Paloma Beamer and Nicholas Lopez Galvez, who I believe are on the phone, were also very involved in this project. Also, many OEHHA and CalRecycle staff who helped us videotape. I think too numerous to mention right now. So the objective of our project was to, in simple terms, characterize exposure-related human activity patterns to support OEHHA's effort to model exposures resulting from use of synthetic turf fields. To provide kind of a little context, this is California. We wanted to generate information for California. So our goals here were to provide current statewide information specific to California. We also wanted to work with real soccer players. And to date, there's really nothing in the literature with this level of detail. So we're trying to both add to the literature and really form a solid base of information that could be used for the exposure and risk assessment. We collected information from a wide cross-section of California soccer players across many different demographic factors, geographic area, ages, and player position to try to get a comprehensive picture of the population. Just to give a quick overview of the soccer population in California, there's about 450,000 people estimated to be currently participating in soccer. Many of them are youth, many in recreational or competitive teams associated with high schools or clubs. The numbers go down as you get older. As probably get into high school, we have more students playing on probably JV teams, which are more selective. And then numbers dwindle a little bit more as we get into adults. But still, a really important point should be taken here is that adults, many people often play soccer into adulthood. And for many, it's a lifelong sport. And it's also very, as was mentioned earlier, pretty evenly balanced between men and women. So it's really an important activity in California, recreational activity, and it also is growing. To give a sense of what we've done so far, there were two components of the study. One was an online survey where we solicited soccer players and their parents throughout California and asked them a series of questions. I'll be reporting on that. Our goal there was to get at least 1,000 responses online. And then the second component also involved a questionnaire, but more importantly, we also did videotaping of the games and practices to really quantify and look at behaviors. This data is currently being analyzed by the University of Arizona, so we don't have it. It was mentioned earlier that we just completed our online survey just a few weeks ago, so our data analysis to date is preliminary. I also want to mention too that our data today will be for the full set of data we have, whereas the information in the study in the meeting materials was a preliminary sample of about 650 or 700 participants. For the in-person survey, we administered questionnaire to players or parents, and our goal there was to get 40 participants from up to 10 games and under a variety of positions. To develop the questionnaire, we have a lot of intensive discussions among ourselves and with OEHHA, and also soccer players and coaches around the state. We focused on people using Crumb rubber synthetic turf fields with Crumb rubber. Again, we collected information, demographics, contact frequency, information to inform potential dermal and ingestion exposures, information on exertion to inform inhalation exposures, also hygiene practices and player history. And you'll see we're going to report on a few of these things today. Recruitment, we contacted all the major clubs in California and also other populations active in soccer. We left flyers at in-person events, and we had a Facebook page. We also targeted both competitive and recreational softball teams. So we really tried to make a broad effort and sent thousands of emails. Emails were sent to over 10,000 addresses in both English and Spanish. And I should mention too that because of our IRB constraints, and consent procedures, we asked parents to respond for children under 18, and then adults 18 or over responded for themselves. And this was done between December and April 2008. For the in-person questionnaire and videotaping, recruitment was similar. We contacted coaches and managers in both the San Francisco and Sacramento areas, usually the coach to help us identify potential participants, and then we obtained permission to attend the scheduler game, and then we coordinated consent and compliance based on our IRB protocols. So the videotaping was quite labor intensive, involved 2 team members for each player, one to record and one to take notes. For the questionnaire, children under 14, we administered the questionnaire to their parents. If they were over than 14, it was completed by the player themselves. And for the videotaping, we also were in the same time period as the online questionnaire, December through just last month in April. Some preliminary information now on what we found. We were successful in obtaining many responses. We had over 1,000 responses for the questionnaire online, about 1,028 or 29, and with our videotaping, we have almost 1,070 responses for questionnaires, and we did successfully videotape 40 soccer players. Just to give a brief overview of the participants we videotaped, and again, this information is being analyzed as we speak, so I won't be talking about the videotape today, but in general, we got very good balance between both games and practices, and also a broad age range from the U9 or the kids down to 8 years old, and then through young adulthood. This gives a sense of where our respondents lived for the online questionnaire. And in general, we have good representation for California. And also this tends to represent the distribution of synthetic turf fields in California. It's a little bit brighter in the Bay Area. I think that might be perhaps because we were doing our videotaping here and there's a little more word-to-mouth outreach and maybe we had a higher response. But overall, we have pretty good geographic balance. Now just a brief summary of some of the demographic information. We have good breakdown of ages. About 80% you see in that group are between about 9 and 25. So kind of youth, young adult is the biggest proportion of our response. And that's actually pretty proportional to what we found when we looked at the soccer population in California. So we do have good representation of that specific age group, but also a wide range of ages as well. Good balance in gender in terms of male and female. And we also have a fairly good balance in terms of demographics. If you look at this carefully, I don't have a highlight there, but if you see, we had about 60% identify themselves as Caucasian, about 15% as Hispanic, and then another 13% as mixed. In general, I think we are a little underweighted in terms of Latino and Spanish speaking, but overall, I think we have pretty good representation here. We did do everything in English and Spanish, but you see down at the bottom that the vast majority of respondents were English speakers. In terms of positions, again, I think we have very good balance here in terms of the key soccer game positions. And particularly, I know there's a lot of interest in potential exposures to goalies, and we have about 120 responses for that population. Proportionally, that's actually about what you see on a team. You have 9 or 10 players and one goalie on the field at any given time, so about 10%, 11% are goalies. So we have good representation there. We also see that many of the people who responded were involved in competitive soccer, and many also were played year-round. So I think many of our respondents were pretty hardcore soccer players, and that perhaps that motivated them to participate here. In terms of player characteristics or some additional information, so this slide here gives you a reported proportion of practices on synthetic turf fields that they self-reported that they played on. And just to make the point here, about 40% were in our highest category. So over 70%, so 5% of the time, that was where their practices took place, and then similar for games. So a significant proportion are spending most or perhaps even all of their practice and games on synthetic turf fields. So here's some information that ultimately will be helpful when we start talking about developing models. Here we have some information about average weeks per year children played on synthetic turf fields. And in general, you can see if there's any pattern in this data. And I don't want people to focus on individual numbers here. But some of the points here is that, when they're young, they're playing a couple weeks a year. As they go older, it goes up. And I think that makes sense because they're more active and they're on more competitive teams. I've heard from my colleagues that often the younger kids are more likely to be on grass. And then also, if we look at the upper range here, many of these children in all age categories are spending a lot of weeks per year. Even some of the young kids, 40 weeks per year, and the older kids are playing every week. So there's a wide range of engagement with soccer and synthetic turf fields. Now we're talking about average hours per week played on synthetic turf fields. Again, something we can use to develop parameters for exposure models, and very similar results. Kind of the point being that as they get older, the people who stick with the sport are playing more. And then as we look at the upper range, there's a significant proportion that are spending a lot of time on those fields. Here now we're talking about adult player life history. Because we were asking adults about their, what they may have done 20, 30 years ago, we had slightly different categories. But again, we kind of repeat what we found earlier. Earlier, you see here that at the median level, for example, they report actually in their youth relatively low use of synthetic turf fields. But if we look at the higher 95th percentile up there, we see many of them do report spending 40 works a year when they were younger playing on those fields. Another point here is that for some of these adults who are older, maybe when they were playing as youth, there weren't that many synthetic turf fields because they're a relatively recent phenomenon. And then again, more information about hours per week for the adults and what they report. And again, similar pattern here we have that we had to the weeks. We had a few hours a week on the median level, but then again at the higher range, many adults reporting spending significant amount of times historically that they spent playing on synthetic fields. We also asked people just to categorize what was their longest time played on a single day. And some of the key points here is that, again, when we look at our highest category, a good 5 to 10% of people are spending a significant amount of time on synthetic turf fields. And we can use this information to help build exposure scenarios. We also asked about exertion. And exertion, of course, is tied to inhalation. This can support better understanding of inhalation exposures. Again, I know there's a lot of numbers up here, so just to give you kind of a sense of the range, if we look for practices, for example, the median reported resting period. So these categories are actually very similar to some of the US EPA guidelines for exertion level. If we look at the self-reported period of resting, say during practice, the average was that they spent about 10% of the time resting, some people as much as 55%. And then if we look at the highly active on the right, on average, they're reporting that they're about very active 35% of the time, but then there's the real go-getter people who are saying they're extremely active for 100% of the time. So again, we can use this to build exposure models, and then you can see some of the numbers in between. For each participant, these proportions add up to 100%. So we can actually develop, say, participant-specific exertion and potentially inhalation exposure estimates, and then look at those distributions. And I won't belabor too much the findings for games, but again, it was similar in terms of a wide range of numbers. Median was about 10% of the time resting during a game, although I noticed the max here was a little higher at 90%. Maybe that's somebody who's benched a lot of the time. And then at the highly active, we have the stars who are out in the field 100% of the time. So again, a lot of the information I'm presenting today, we're kind of presenting averages, but we also want to look at the distribution. We also asked some questions about contact with crumb rubber during practices and games. So these were some questions about crumb rubber reported crumb rubber in their mouths, and that's actually, I think, very relevant to Dr. Claude's presentation a few minutes ago, and also crumb rubber in eyes, and whether also they're fiddling and playing with crumb rubber. That might apply to some of the younger kids. But if we look here, say on the left for practices, about a little under 20% of the respondents are saying they got crumb rubber in their mouth at least sometimes. Some people more frequently. You can look at the stacked bar there and the legend. About 12% said they got it in their eyes sometimes, and 18% they at least fiddle or play with it sometimes too. And very similar results when we look at the findings for games, although a little more reported that they were playing with it. Maybe they're bored when they're on the sidelines or nervous with the game and a little more active with their environment. Now, we took that, though, and we looked at whether there were differences in positions. In particular, I know there's a lot of interest in goalies versus other positions. The goalies here were actually distinctly different in the proportions that reported getting material in their mouth or their eyes. The other positions were actually all very similar, so we combined them. And you can see there the goalies reported at least about 40% of the time they got it in their mouth, at least sometimes. And for the others, it was about positions about 16%. So about if we look at that cutoff of at least sometimes, they were about 3 times more common for the goalies getting it in their mouth, and a similar ratio actually for getting crumb rubber in their eyes. So I think that is informative for some of the discussions we can have later. And important relative to Dr. Claude's presentation. So there's little arrows to kind of make it a little easier to see. Sorry. So we also, related to that, we also asked about dive frequency. And again, we're comparing goalies versus other positions. The other positions were all very similar, except for the goalies. And if you see here, for example, you look at practices and games, and many of the goalies, 50 or 60% of them are reporting that they dive, more than 10 times during a practice or game. So just to make the point here that, as has been suggested, that goalies are very likely to have more contact with the material in the fields. We also asked questions about how frequently they observe crumb rubber on kind of personal objects or themselves. And again, you can see that pretty significant. We asked about water bottles, and again, this is what people can see. Of course, there may be other residues there. A few percent talked about water, but about half report seeing crumb rubber on their clothes, and about a third on their body. And this is clearly fairly common phenomena. We also asked them about whether they might be seeing crumb rubber in their homes. And I know from a personal anecdote point of view, I noticed crumb rubber in my house after videotaping. Many of the participants report seeing crumb rubber in their garage and laundry room, probably where they're taking off their shoes or just coming into the house. But also a significant portion report seeing crumb rubber in more interior regions of the house. So that's some information we should think about in terms of perhaps exposures en route home and perhaps in the home. But that's something that was, again, commonly reported. So when we start, this is fairly qualitative, but we wanted to get a sense of like what the volume of material or people coming home. Most people are saying less than a tablespoon. We had some guidelines for them to make a selection. A few of them are talking about getting a quarter or even half a cup of material. And I know many people end up dumping the material out of their shoes after games. So there's the potential for, anyway, just consistent with our understanding of it getting carried in clothing and the potential for exposures after they leave the field. We also asked some questions about potential health concerns. And again, I want to emphasize that this is not an epidemiologic study, and this is very qualitative. Some of the concerns that people mentioned were about being overheated sometimes. In fact, that was almost 80% of participants responded to that as a concern. Others mentioned odors, headaches, eye and nose irritation or nausea. But again, I'm sure these things occur in a grass field too on a hot day. So we can't say that this is specific, but it perhaps gives us some things to think about when we consider some of the exposure issues. In terms of next steps, we'll be analyzing the time activity video data this summer. We hope to get it in the next few weeks from University of Arizona. Analyses, of course, will include evaluation of contact with objects, activities and intensity, time spent on fields. We'll probably be looking at some of that videotape data in relation to questionnaire information. And then this data will be helpful and will be important to inform some of the exposure modeling with OEHHA. So thank you. I think I'm just about 10 seconds over.
Thank you, Asa. So now we can open up the panel discussion of both the time activity study and the pathways of exposure presentation of Dr. Claude. So, Tom, are you ready to go? You look at.
Tom, is your mic on?
There we go. Now, just to repeat, I'll start with the presentation on pathways and kind of go in order. I thought the pathway diagram was very informative, and I really don't think anything is missing, but I suppose we can struggle and find something. But I think it's a very useful way to show the various pathways, and I think it's very important to disaggregate the different ingestion pathways. I mean, I think it's useful and it ties in well with the activity patterns. I mean, ultimately, it looks like this is going to fit together pretty well. I think that's important. It doesn't look like somebody, often you see these studies and the time activity doesn't make sense with the basic overall framework of the exposure model. And then you go, well, how are you going to fit it all together? But here it looks like things are going to integrate well. Let's see. I don't think anything, from my perspective, I don't know about pathways being overlooked, receptor categories. And at this point, I didn't notice anything sticking out. I guess the one thing that struck me was I looked at the number of your first slide, number of people engaged in California. Actually, there's 400,000. That's only like 1% of the population. I assume that's okay. That's your data, but I thought maybe more people would be involved in the sport than just 1%. And I know that most of it is in children, so it goes up. That's probably, when you look at the numbers, it's probably more like 4 or 5%, which of the population between 4 and 18, which maybe makes sense. Again, I thought it might be a little higher, but I don't know if somebody asks or if it comes up, if there's a way to compare that to other sports. Like, I actually think football is lower, tackle football, which is a very popular sport, but the level of engagement is low, and I think baseball is probably comparable, or basketball, some of those. But I don't know if you want to, just for comparison, put that in.
That is something that we thought about. We have a little bit of narrative in our report, and probably we'll have a little bit more in the final report. The thing about soccer is it's a little bit more broadly played, whereas football and baseball often narrow down into, often into like high school and other teams, and kids who aren't on those teams usually don't play. There's less recreational or clubs outside, say, the high school or school environment. And so it kind of funnels down to a much smaller population. I think that's overall why we see more kids playing soccer, especially as they get older. And then there's this trend of increasing soccer playing, and there's also a trend of decreasing football playing. So we have kind of I think a shift going on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little out of this range, although we have a lot of kids in our neighborhood that my own children are older, but I guess it doesn't matter that much, but it seems to me that it's hard to get the numbers. Soccer is much more easy to just engage in without a formal sport. And I think certainly tackle football is a very exclusive sport now. Basketball, much less so. It's very informal, and I don't know whether soccer, there's a lot that wouldn't be counted because people just play it in the local park.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
But it's probably not relevant they're probably not going to be playing on synthetic turf.
Right.
If they're just going to the park and kicking a ball around.
Right.
Okay.
One thing we found, the synthetic turf fields are highly scheduled and in high demand.
Yeah. Well, I ride my bike down by the water in Berkeley. Those soccer fields are always occupied, no matter when I'm down there riding my bike for recreation. That's just anecdotal, but it is fascinating. They are.
Just trying to provide some supplemental observation we have when we out in the field. Randy and I, when we go to the field, a lot of time we have to fight with the people who occasionally drop in and just want to kick their soccer. So there's a lot of people that are not captured in this table who are just dropping in, and a lot of them actually do it more like a day-to-day basis. They just kick the ball before they have to go to work in the afternoon. We see a lot of those adults that do unstructured or club activity kind of player.
So I guess I'll just end my comments with, it says, please comment on the time activity behavior study. I think it's really useful and very well done. I think the one thing to think about now is, as this moves toward a risk assessment, we're going to have concentration data, we're going to have the exposure pathways, we're going to have the activity, but ultimately we're going to have, and I'm jumping ahead, but we're going to have to think about the unit intake or uptake, or the loading associated with each of these, with the co-occurrence of a pathway and a concentration and an activity. I mean, that's going to be where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Or anyway, thanks.
Thank you for all the excellent presentations. I think overall it's reasonable. The things, I don't know if they've been overlooked. The things that stuck out to me as maybe deserving a little more attention are the infants and toddlers. Because, I mean, kids can pick up a whole handful of stuff and put it in their mouth. So they're not exactly in the same as other kinds of bystanders. And so I wonder if maybe they deserve their own category or a little bit more attention in some appropriate way. I know you mentioned it, so I know you're aware of it, but it didn't quite seem to come across in the structure of this in a way that it might deserve. I wondered. The second thing is, I think everything that you've laid out makes sense. I wonder again if there's another emphasis or pathway or something having to do to this take-home concept of, it's not just if it's on the water bottle or something, it's also once it gets into your vehicle, your house, your washing machine, which is where I used to find crumb rubbers in my car, crumbled up more, and then in the washer. So I wonder, just looking at it through those lens across your pathways, whether that would be informative. And ASA's thinking about that also and has introduced this take-home idea. And I think it's just something I think it could be important to look at. I'm a little shocked to see how much some people report having at home. I mean, that's a lot of stuff, so that might be worth considering. Let's see. Oh, and this is a small point, but is synthetic turf the same as crumb rubber? Because there was an era where synthetic turf was AstroTurf.
For all of our focus was on synthetic turf fields containing crumb rubber.
Okay.
So we only did videotaping and asked questions. And in some cases, I kind of shortened the sentence because it's kind of a mouthful.
It's a small point. I just, I just wondered a little bit about that. So, and then my last comment is that the technical term for people who show up randomly to play soccer is pickup games.
Thank you. No soccer play. Synthetic turf include non-grass field, so they can have different infill. So our study focused on crumb rubber as one of the ingredients, and AstroTurf is one of the big manufacturer who manufactures synthetic turf.
So I just have a couple of questions. I also appreciated the layout and the pathways, but I do have one question, especially, I guess, substantiated in a way by Ace's comment about what he brings home just having video tape this. And that is that I think that you might want to take another look at your referee X's and checks on your pathway, because I think in the direct dermal pathway, certainly for the center ref who runs up and down the field the whole time, I think my guess is if you got an informal survey and asked a dozen of them, sort of what do you take home, you'd find out they have the same sort of feet picture that were not Randy's feet, often as well. So I think there's an exposure there. The rest of my points sort of are maybe more trivial in the sense of being clear about the communication and the limitations of the discussion that or the report you're going to make in writing. And that is, you made a comment, somebody made a comment, I guess maybe Asa said it both ways. First, that under 18 was done by parent questionnaire, but then on the plots, under 14 was done by parent questionnaire. So it's one or the other, I guess, potentially what happened. And the only reason I bring it up is the 13 to 17 age range that you had on another table had a fair amount of time spent and hours spent on the field. So whether our experience has been that, if you ask a kid what they've been doing and you ask their parent what they've been doing, you get different answers. And so I think you've got to be careful about, who you're asking, especially in those early adolescent, teen years.
Right, and that was a challenge to this. For the online questionnaire, well, actually, let me say it in reverse order. For the in-person, we have our IRB protocol, and we can get consent from the parent and assent from the child. And for the online, basically, they said to us, because we don't have a mechanism to verify.
Okay.
We had to say, you can only fill out this form if you're over 18, but you can fill it out for your child. So,
So that was my confusion. I think you just need to be clear in your report,
Yeah.
which is online, which is actual interview, because it looks like there's a conflict there that it's not internally consistent.
Right.
So, on the ethnicity question, I assume those are self-described.
Correct.
Okay. On the, again, careful about general statements on the adult player life history. I think you're probably right that depending on what the age was of the adults that you're talking about, probably the availability of synthetic fields when they were youth was much lower. And so you may think that it looks like they're increasing with age, but it really isn't the case. And then finally, on overheated, the comment about, how often overheating, you made some passing comment about, well, probably people get overheated playing on grass fields as well. But I think part of the concern with the synthetic fields is the fact of the heat load and retention on them. And so my guess is, I guess I could be disproved by your activity data, but my guess is that people that play on synthetic fields, there probably is a higher reporting of overheating because, in fact, it is warmer on those fields.
Right, yeah.
I thought that it would be good on some of the questions to break it down by age group. So, questions like how often do they play with the chrome rubber during the games? Like that would be a really good one to break down by age. And then also on something like percent seen chrome rubber on their water bottle or on their clothes or whatever. It seemed like you had about 25% of the population that doesn't regularly play on chrome rubber, so I think you might want to stratify that by people that primarily play on chrome rubber and those that don't, because I'm curious if there might be some big differences there. On the categorization of the pathways, I had a comment on the refs too, because I know in our neighborhood the competitive rec players ref for the recreational kids. So sometimes the refs are also kids that are, players as well. And then I was a little confused on when Tom was asking about the players table. I decided I was confused on that too, because the 14 to 18 seemed to be overlapping. I think because you had the rec players and the high school players.
So if you look at these slides, when you add them up.
No, not that one. At the beginning. How many players there are? That one. So I think probably, I'm guessing you've got some competitive, I guess it's because the way you had information to the leagues. It's just you've got 14 to 18-year-olds in there twice, but I guess that's because of the high school. Those aren't high schoolers. Those are high school teams.
Correct.
And then you can have high school players in the, okay. Yeah, and I was just really surprised by the high number of the people complaining about being overheated and the odor. And was that ever or frequently, or that just their concerns, or?
Ever.
Okay. Yeah, they're big numbers. They're much higher than I would have expected.
Thank you. So I echo the comments of everyone else on the panel. Just two additional comments. I think it was a nice idea to decide to focus on soccer players to really target the questions and be able to do very thorough analyses of this study population. So I think that was a good idea. And so I had a related question. Were all the fields that were studied, were they all soccer fields, or were some of them football fields, from the earlier discussion this morning?
No, they are not all soccer fields. They are, a lot of them are multiple purpose field, because the price of getting these field, they have different color sets. So we have been to field that are purely football, purely soccer. A lot of them are soccer and football with multiple lines. The most surprisingly we saw is a football field drawn on top of a soccer field, and on the side there's baseball field.
Wow.
So it is a multi-use because of that's why it's so hard to get on the field, because it's so highly used. Yeah. So, but in terms of material, we have been seeing that they are fairly similar in terms of structure and the crumb rubber. So that's our observation.
Thank you. And my second comment is that, if I'm understanding right, I think the online survey and the in-person surveys were all only of athletes. And the pathway study is of athletes and bystanders and refs and coaches. So was that a conscious decision to only be doing the survey of athletes? And I guess, do you have any thoughts on that?
That was a big focus for our videotaping, and so it was. And so we asked lots of questions about, player history and things like that. We're going to be talking about in a bit some of the playground activities. So we actually are going to have some information that can inform looking at different age groups. I'm not sure if that answers all of your question.
Kind of related to some comments earlier on from the panel that, maybe the refs are doing behaviors that, I guess the question is how well are they represented by the conceptual pathways? We don't quite have data to back that up at this point.
Yeah, part of the study design, because we believe athlete has most exposure, so we focus on it. And also it's easier to recruit athletes, so we have to admit that. And also the other, like Dr. Bregman has said, we are also have ongoing archive video to look at children, their behavior on playground and grass turf. So try to get some idea of behavior being outdoor to model the bystander. Part of it address Dr. Kyle's address that bystander, young people, especially toddler. We're going to have some contact frequency data come out from archive study, because it's very hard to do IRB approval for young kids.
As the mom of a 1.5-year-old who just had his first kick-and-play soccer lesson last week, I appreciate focusing on the younger children also. So,
Yes,
thank you.
I have one question. I think there's a tremendous amount of data here in this time activity behavior study. I do think you need to verify the answers to some of those questions. I mean, the fact that you are asking an adult, a mother or a father, to answer questions about the level of play of their child, whether or not they were overheated or nauseous, whether or not they observed crumb rubber on their water bottle while playing. I think that it's a perception of what they've done, but I do think that you need to do something that sort of says which are, how believable are these answers? And, I don't have a problem with saying, so this is the perception, it's not the actual, it's the perception, but I do think that if there is something you can do that is not, a whole nother study in itself, but what are those, once you get to modeling, what are going to be those most important questions? And is there a way that you can back it up with your video data, with, somebody going out and observing more, doing something?
I mean, also something like the water bottle, it's going to stick to the water bottle the same if you're an adult or a kid. So you could break it out between the adult responders and the kids, because then you know that the adults are responding for themselves. That might be a thought.
And I just have a quick follow-up. I wonder if those 40 children, or I think were they all children who did the in-person study? I wonder if you could just administer the survey to their parents and see what the correspondence is between those kids.
Okay, last question here, because we're behind. We've gotten behind now.
One quick comment, again, going back to the communication aspect. In the materials from this morning, in the introduction of the fields, there is this talk about the fields that were laid out in pictures of the diamonds and the football field and the soccer field. And I just point out, because the baseball diamond typically has a dirt infield, and then the sort of the synthetic other part, that if in fact you're focusing on the soccer field, you should just say so in there at the outfront and why you did it that way, which I think is defensible. Just say it.
Okay, and I lied. I have one more question or comment. So how are you going to do the modeling? Actually, this goes back to one of the questions this morning. When I think of, is it going to be a probabilistic model? Is it going to be a microactivity model? And the reason I ask this is that I did a lot of measurements. I worked with a lot of modelers. They always wanted me to have measurements in 80 locations across whatever area I was measuring so that they could understand the variability, especially the variability. And so I don't know how you're going to model, but I do think that when it goes back to the monitoring and the analysis of the samples, make sure that you have at least, it doesn't have to be all the samples, but enough samples so that you can bring in variability on the field. So no more questions are allowed now.